Good morning, everyone. I remember very well when, I think it was a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, I spoke to the chief exec of the Swedish Heat Pump Association, and I asked him, why is it that people in Sweden don't buy fossil fuel boilers anymore? And he looked at me and couldn't really understand the question. He said, like, nobody even asked that question. We just buy heat pumps. And he was so puzzled by the question, which for me, as someone who lives in the UK and also does a lot of work in continental Europe, this is the question. How do we actually persuade people to make the right choice that is better for the climate and ultimately better for the energy system and for their pockets? And in Sweden, this was no longer a discussion, according to the chief executive of the Heat Pump Association, of course. But that story stuck with me. And today I'm just going to spend a few minutes to sort of look at the Swedish story and what we can potentially learn from it for the UK and elsewhere. And I have a few slides. I hope they will work. I'm just going to click on this. Yes, there they are. So I'm just going to start. I have 4 slides, very simple, and it's mainly some data points just to sort of show you a little bit what Sweden has done. And the first slide I have for you is just to show the annual installations in Sweden since the early 1980s. And what you can see here is the annual installation rate in Sweden. Just to put this into context, so right now Sweden does about 200,000 heat pumps per year. That varies a little bit year by year. The latest data for the UK, I don't know, Charlotte, whether you're going to present an estimate later on in the panel discussion, but I think last year maybe 70,000 roughly, could be a bit more, depending on whether we count in air-to-air heat pumps. Maybe it's 100,000, I don't know, but it's certainly, compared to Sweden, this is impressive, right? This is an impressive number given the size of the country. So the second point I wanted to make is when you look at when most of this deployment happened, it actually happened in about 2 decades. There's some that happened early on, and there was a phase of preparing the market, but really most of the deployment, you can see, started in the early 2000s, and it's happened in just about 2 decades. It's not done yet. There's still properties that need new heat pumps and haven't been retrofitted with heat pumps yet. But Sweden has come a very, very long way. I sometimes hear people say on social media that energy transitions will take centuries. They have read Václav Smil. I don't know whether you know who he is, but he's written several books on how long it takes to transition. Well, this data, to me, actually makes me hopeful. And like the title of this session, how to focus on what could be a good thing that we could be doing, rather than just be depressed by the negativity that is so often prevalent in the discussion. The second point I wanted to make on this slide is that when you look at the kinds of heat pumps that have been installed, you will see in the light blue here, or turquoise color, that is air-to-air heat pumps. And in the early days, it was mainly ground source heat pumps, some air-to-air, some air-to-water, but air-to-air heat pumps dominate the Swedish market. Very different story to the UK, where most of the residential installs almost exclusively are air-to-water heat pumps. And in fact, the government fundings programs currently discourage air-to-air heat pumps because there's a lack of funding for them. But in Sweden, they are the dominant technology. And maybe we can get into that later in the discussion, why that is and what the differences are. I don't have time in my little speech to go into that. But that's an important difference to the UK, is the kind of technology that has been installed. You probably have air-to-air heat pumps even in this building, I would imagine. They are everywhere. And Nathan, who is in the audience, often points out that the journalists who hate heat pumps and write articles about them usually sit in a building that is heated and cooled by a heat pump. So air-to-air heat pumps are also quite common in the UK, but not in residential buildings so much. Second slide. This is, it's a very busy slide, and some of you will have seen this before, but I think it's important to show it for 2 reasons. One is that it shows the penetration of heat pumps in Sweden. That is on the x-axis here, and Sweden is over here. It shows the number of heat pumps installed per 100 households. So this is the current stock of heat pumps. So in other words, in Sweden, almost half of the population, in statistical terms, have a heat pump. Yes, some buildings might have 2 or 3 heat pumps, but not all of them. It's a very high penetration compared to other countries. You see the UK is right here. I think Hungary is the only other country that is last, and the UK is second to last. They might have changed a bit. I mean, this data is out of date. It's from a paper we published in Nature a couple of years back using 2020 data. So it has changed for sure. But the main point I wanted to make really is that Sweden is standing out in being one of the countries with the highest penetration. Norway is in front of Sweden. That's the only other country we could find with a higher penetration of heat pumps. The second, and also I think very important point here, is that when you look at the y-axis, this shows you how cold it gets in the different countries. This is the number of heating degree days. I guess not all of you know what that means, and you don't have to. It means actually how cold it gets in a country in an average year. So the higher up you are, the colder it gets, the more cold days you have. Don't ask me exactly about the metric. It's very confusing because it's actually not the number of days. You can't have more than 365 days in a year. If you want to know exactly what that is, you can look it up. But it's a metric that is commonly used to measure how cold it gets. So you see Sweden up here, one of the coldest places. Look at Finland, Estonia, Norway. So there is a clear correlation that the countries with the most heat pumps are also the countries with the coldest climate. And that seems counterintuitive because people keep telling me on the social media every day that heat pumps don't work when it's cold. And maybe we can get into that. I know Paul has tested heat pumps in Ireland, came to very similar results, that they actually do perform pretty well if installed well. They can perform well even during very cold temperatures. And Sweden gets pretty cold in the winter. There's more to this. It's a bit more complex, but I think we can get into that in the panel discussion. My third slide is on the policy, a bit of a story where how this has happened. And this is from a paper that is now quite dated. It's from a UKERC report that came out almost 10 years ago, I think. And this paper looked at the policy that was driving heat pumps and how heat pumps markets have changed over time. And really the main trigger, and I talked to Charlotte about this before the panel and my talk, the main trigger for Swedish heat pump policy can be traced back to the 1970s, the energy crisis. Sweden burned a lot of heating oil. That was the main source of heating in Sweden. And the energy crisis led to sky-high oil prices, and that triggered the Swedish government to invest in new technologies, R&D, research and development, grants for heat pumps, loans. It took a while. You can see that the numbers on my early slide and also the numbers here in terms of installations are quite low. The main thing that really changed that was, in my view, the carbon price that was introduced in the early 1990s that lowered the so-called spark gap, I come back to that in a minute, and made heat pumps a much more economic proposition, more attractive to consumers. There's also been other issues like consumer trust in the technology that Sweden, I think, addressed pretty well early on, because there were issues as well in Sweden. The same issues we face in the UK, with some poor installations that are being carried out, with a lack of customer redress when things go wrong, and Sweden has handled this pretty well. Surely not perfect. It can't just be copied and pasted into the UK context, as you said. But there are some lessons to be learned that it's important to have consumer reassurance and build trust in the technology. And then the last phase, where we're now really here, is I think, where the market has gotten very mature. You have a very active heat pump association. You have high trust in the technology. People know it. And almost all of new heating equipment that is not district heating, so single-family homes in particular, is almost all exclusively heat pumps. There's no other technologies like gas boilers don't exist anymore pretty much, or oil boilers. It's mainly heat pumps, with some exceptions. Final slide, and then we can move over to the panel discussion. So I wanted to talk about the spark gap a little bit more, because I think that is one of the key lessons perhaps that can be learned also from the UK perspective. So what this shows you, and sorry for you at the back, it's hard to read. You don't need to read the individual country names. What I plotted here is the heat pump penetration, how many heat pumps are being sold in 2023 in each country. That's on your y-axis. And then on the x-axis, that's the ratio between electricity to gas prices. So if you are right over here, they almost have electricity prices that are 5 times as high as gas prices per unit of energy. And if you're all the way over here at 1, they're at the same rate. And what you find is that the lower that ratio, the more heat pumps you get. That's not surprising because, of course, that drives your cost savings. If you have a ratio of, say, 4, you need to have a difference in efficiency of at least 4 to make up for that difference in price. And currently, it changes all the time in the UK, of course, as it does in other places, but currently the UK spark gap is somewhere around 4, depends a bit on which tariff you're on, and that makes it really hard to make savings very visible for consumers. Yes, they're time-varying tariffs, but for the average customer, there are no big savings to be had unless they are smart and do what some people have done and use heat pumps flexibly and have a time-of-use tariff. Maybe we can talk more about that in the panel discussion. I think that gives you a bit of a flavor of what Sweden has done, sort of huge success story in terms of the deployment, but a quite checkered history with lots of policies playing a role there. And primarily, I think the economics and having a carbon price on gas and heating oil early on made a huge difference in the Swedish context. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to what the other panelists have to say. Thank you.